All right, so what bears, deer, and elk do when the weather turns bad? We're talking whiteouts, big rainstorms, when cold temperatures come in, or there's just big fluctuations in temperatures, and if there's deep snow or changing levels of snow on the feed, particularly for deer and elk, right? These different variables and knowing what each one of these species does when those variables change is key to your hunting success. I go species by species: bear, deer, elk. The deer and elk are a little convoluted, but what I'll do, if you're interested in just one of those species, I'll put timestamps in the description of the video so you can just jump to that section of the video. You guys are going to notice that this video is a little bit different format, and that is because it's from my membership group that I do through Patreon right now. If you're interested in the details on that group, go to my website, pursuitwithcliff.com/membership. All the details are there. Sign up for my newsletter. I've got some new merchandise coming out, some cool hats and shirts, much better than what I've got on there right now. So if you sign up for my newsletter, you'll see that. I've got all the hunts that I guide. I've got all the seminars I do. All the experiences are posted up there. So go check it out. But for now, let's dive right into this topic. But the first question is from Matt. So Matt had a question specifically on bears. Or actually, he says elk and bears. How do elk and bears react to rain in different weather conditions, and how should this affect your hunting strategy? And then he mentions a personal example where he was in a situation, and it sounds like the CPW told him at the checkpoint that a lot of bears were checked in at higher elevations after a rain. So I'll touch on that a little bit, but I'll go through each species: bear, mule deer, elk. And what I'm going to cover is I'm going to cover like rain, and then within that, snowstorms, whiteout type of conditions, and then I'll talk about snow level, and then I'll talk about general temperatures and how they affect each species. Um, so the first one, bears, and this is going to vary a little bit spring versus fall, but generally what I have seen is on the day-to-day hunting of bears, particularly in the spring, they slow down if it's pouring rain. I've hunted with a lot of Canadians. I've spent weeks in British Columbia spring bear hunting camps where the really experienced guides, they won't even hunt in the rain. And a matter of fact, they usually won't hunt a couple hours after it's rained. They're waiting for the sun to pop out, and then we would go hunting. Now, granted, during that period of time that you're hunting bears in Canada, in particular in the spring, you have really long days, so you can afford to do that, right? You might have 16 hours of sunlight that day, so if it rains a little bit, no big deal. The let's just hunt when it's sunny, right? So you're able to do that. Now, if you're in a situation down in the 48 states, you might need to push it a little bit harder, and maybe don't hunt during the rain, but right after the rain, you might want to start hunting. Um, I I will say that, and a lot of people have questioned me on that one. I have done some hunting in the rain because there's always this question of like, okay, well, it's just the culture in the spring not to hunt bears in the rain, so therefore no bears get killed in the rain. uh, Myself, as the American that was in a lot of these camps, a lot of times I would push to go hunt during the rain, maybe just because I was a little antsy or whatever. But I've never, the simplest thing I can say about it is I've never skinned a wet black bear, right? A black bear that was just, was shot in the rain and literally is still wet. Like, for sure, I've killed them when they're in dewy vegetation and that sort of thing, but I've never actually killed one in the rain. I've never killed one with a client in the rain. So they do slow down during that period of time. And that does also, that it is the case also that once this if the sun, if they've been getting rained on for 12 hours, and you get that a lot in Canada, you get it in the northern states too, like Idaho, we just have like rain for 24 hours. It is true that when the sun comes out, the bears will come out. Pretty much a couple hours of sun, could be middle of the day. All of a sudden, the bears will come out and feed, and it does seem like they feed more vigorously than they typically do. And I'm sure that's because they just hole up in the rain and get out of the rain. And I'll talk about there's that same dynamic on deer and elk in my experience too. It's a little bit different, but there is that dynamic. Now, rain associated with like an actual environmental condition and then what it does to, things that matter to bears, and then therefore where are you going to find bears the next day, or maybe it's been raining for 5 days and you're hunting the next week, right after this bunch of moisture has entered the area. So in the spring, what'll happen is if you get a big chunk of rain, a lot of times if you're hunting in like the first half of the spring bear season, there'll be a bunch of snow cover, up high, and if you get a bunch of rain, a lot of times that snow will melt off. Canada's notorious for this. Idaho, same deal. Once you get to a certain time of the year in the spring, basically once you get in Idaho, for the most part, once you get like, the 10th of May, 15th of May, if you get rain at the lower elevations, and then it's, basically the worst you're going to have at the higher elevations is like a slushy rain / snow, that type of year. That'd be extreme. You're basically going to get rain. That'll wipe out a bunch of that snow cover, and then typically what'll happen is where all that snow cover came out, and usually it can be dangerous in Canada because you get these crazy flows out of that really steep, avalanche chute type of country. So you have to be cognizant of that. The same thing in Idaho, or other places where those rain, the rain in the spring can melt off a bunch of snow, and then those rivers can implode with drainage. So be careful where you camp, and that sort of thing. But back to what it actually does to bears is you'll get a green up just like you would when the snow melts off any other time. You're going to get a green up 4 or 5 days once that snow's off and the sun starts hitting that barren ground that's wet but has grass seed in it from last year. That's where you're going to get your green up. And then a lot of bears that are in that area, they'll wake up because, for all the reasons I talked about, I think in the last live stream, actually, when I talked about bear hunting, they're going to get triggered to wake up. But the other thing is a lot of bears that have already been up for a couple of weeks at the lower elevations, they will head to the high country because they want to hunt. They want to not hunt. They want to just find that fresh green grass. There's a lot of bears that will move up and down the elevation grade because they want that fresh green grass. Now, I think what Matt mentions in the fall, he experienced this in the fall in Colorado. The only thing that I can think of, Matt, is wherever you were. Like, I'm not saying this, the folks at CPW are not totally correct. Like, that could happen in an area. The only thing that I have seen, after a big chunk of rain in the fall is, like, if the bears moved up in the fall, it has to be feed related, right? Because bears, that's the only thing that matters in the feed. In the spring, you got a bunch of different elements. They're dispersing, the ruts in June. There's calving season, but in the fall, the bears only care about what the berries are doing, what the acorns are doing, what the food source is doing. So the only thing I can think of in that area is there are areas I know, like in Montana, there's a bunch of areas where in particular grizzlies will go to high elevation after certain environmental conditions because grubs and stuff will all of a sudden come out in like an enormous, it's almost like a fly fishermen are always talking about like a hatch. It's the same thing. Bears know when there's certain type of conditions, they'll go up to the higher elevations after rain or whatever, whatever set of conditions, and then they'll go up to those elevations because they know there's a feed source there. So I don't know the specific situation that you're talking about in Colorado. My experience in Colorado is I didn't see that. I didn't like all the bears that I was hunting in the fall. They're hunting, they were eating acorns, serviceberry, choke cherry, kind of lower canyon type of feed, and they were just sticking to that. So I didn't see a big difference in terms of if it was wet or not. Now, in terms of the whole year, like the seasonal moisture level, it matters a lot on fall bears, right? But I don't think that's what we're talking about here. And the reason that it matters is that it's just correlated to those feed sources. If you have a lot of dispersed moisture throughout the spring, summer. You're gonna have, your acorns and berries are gonna be, most of them are gonna go off, and then the crop will actually be better typically, right? Acorns seem to fluctuate regardless of that in a lot of areas, but your berries for sure are gonna be related to moisture. So that's kind of my long-winded thought on that. In terms of, we covered kind of the, rain, snow part of this discussion. Snow is going to be the same with bears. I guess in the fall, the only thing about snow and temperatures, I'll hit those together on the bear front, is once you get snow and colder temperatures in the fall, the bear hunting typically just shuts down. For us in the flat tops in particular, we would have hunters that would have, first rifle bear tags, which in a lot of these seasons would be like October 10th it would start, or October 15th it would start. But we, literally up until September 30th, we could be having a heyday with bears, having phenomenal bear hunting. And then we'd have a little gap there, and then first rifle would start. And I always had a few people with bear tags, and we didn't kill a whole lot of them during that period of time, and we didn't see as many typically. And that's typically because in that period of time, that's when your higher elevations in Colorado starts to get like a pretty solid freeze at night. There just starts to be, colder temperatures, at least your low temperatures. So what I would see then is that the bears would just start to slow down their activity level. The chances of just running into bears went down a whole lot during that period of time, usually. Now, if it was warm for some reason, you'd see just like the late September kind of activity. They were just basically going to postpone doing their whole, denning type of deal, right? It's just all based on temperatures and what they were doing. But generally, cold weather slows bears down a ton. Hot weather in the spring it slows them down too. I would say that early spring, depending on where you're at, sunny days actually kind of gets them out feeding. But once you get like when I've hunted them into late May into June in Idaho, southern British Columbia, and then central to northern British Columbia, in all three of those places, once you get into like what feels like real summer, when you get exceptionally warm days, shuts the bear hunting down, just like any other species, right? If it's warm, they're spending more time. They're spending more time feeding those prime times, early morning, at night, and with bears, it's particularly at night, or in the afternoon to the night. They'll contain their movement and feeding during that period of time, which makes sense. I mean, they have a black hide, right, a thick black hide, so they're going to slow down just because they don't want to be out in the heat all the time. And then the other thing too is they start to rub their hides really bad when it gets warm, and I think that's just they're encouraged by the fact that they're, hot as hell. They want to get the old hide off of them, so you'll see them. You'll actually see bears a lot of times. You'll start to see really exposed parts of their hide. Some bears will be rubbing their face. You'll see that sort of thing. That tends to happen in June. On mule deer, in terms of the same environmental variables, so rain and snowstorms, and I don't need to cover this again on elk when I get there. I'll just put elk and mule deer in the same zone on this. In general, I saw that the hunting in Colorado in particular, doesn't matter if it's September, October, November, during the storm, right? So during a time when it's raining a ton, or it's snowing a ton, or whiteout conditions, any of that sort of thing, the hunting is not very good. And again, people will say, well, a lot of people just don't want to hunt during that period of time. I can tell you, dealing with a lot of hunters up in the mountains and in my guided camps, a lot of people, they're so excited to go hunting. If you pack guys into a camp and then you got 2 days of like whiteout conditions, they want to hunt. So we would go hunting. I've spent a ton of time trying to glass elk up in, where I could only see 150, 200 yards and, or less, 100 yards. And again, they just hole up. You don't see them. They're not moving as much. And when you do see them, I've seen a lot of elk, like when I was packing and I had to be moving around, going to camps or whatever, you'd see elk, you could catch them in the timber and when, during a feeding hour, right, like right in the morning, right at night, and they would just literally just be stacked up together, sitting under conifers. They're just holed up in, to get through the storm. That's generally what I saw with those sort of conditions. So I always encourage people just to wait them out, save your energy, save your effort until those conditions broke. Um, because usually, well, I'll get into that when I get to temperatures, but hunting during the storms doesn't make an enormous amount of sense, is basically what I'm getting at. Okay, let me just look here. So, Matt, you sent me a message. Copy all. I found a ton of choke cherries and acorns where I was. Maybe just got some bad intel, but this will help me tremendously this fall. Yeah, Matt, I don't know, man. It would be really interesting to have got like just a little more explanation of like, it had to be feed related. Um, and it could have been totally something in that area. It might have been interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if it was like a grub thing or something like that. And they're going up higher elevation because of that. But yeah, so on mule deer, the actual storms covered that. Now, snow cover. People ask me a lot about this because if you're hunting any of the western states, it's relevant, particularly if you're not archery hunting them, you're hunting them during rifle. And so during those periods of time, where you're going to hunt the deer, if they're moving, if they're not moving, it will relate to snow cover in this sense. So deer, in my personal view, it doesn't take that much snow cover, like semi-permanent snow cover even on the ground, for them to start moving out of the high country. So anything like 3 to 6 inches, from what I saw, most of the deer would move on that level of snow, which isn't a lot in a lot of the West, right? Like one storm can do that easy. One storm can do quadruple that. So that's enough to start to stimulate them moving. Now, if you get something like that crazy early, it does happen in September. I've seen that kind of snow in late August, that super high elevations. In that kind of stuff, the deer may move a little bit and they'll come right back. But outside of that freak early stuff, basically anything after October, 7th, 10th, whatever in there, once the deer move, they're not coming back. So if they get 3 to 6 inches of snow that lingers around for 2 or 3 days, where they feel limited by feed a little bit, they'll move down. And this can be a little bit geography specific and vegetation specific. So if you're talking about deer that go to the alpine, right? They pretty much like the kind of deer that we think about in Wyoming, Colorado, parts of Idaho, the deer that are going up to the high country in the summer and coming back down to the winter range. These type of deer in different areas, they're eating different things. But if they're mountain deer, when they go up into their summer range and spring summer range before they come down, they're eating a lot of grasses. In some areas and in flat tops in particular, they'll eat young willows, and you'll see that in other high alpine areas. They'll be feeding on young willows, browsing on young willows is really the correct term. But they do eat a lot of I shouldn't say grasses. They're still, they don't eat as much grasses as say elk do, but it looks like they're eating grasses. They're actually just eating like the clovers, the forbs that are in, the meadow, the same meadows that you see elk, feeding in, and then there'll be some mule deer. A lot of times those mule deer are actually not eating the same feed that the elk are. The elk are eating grasses, the mule deer are eating the little forbs. Now, the thing is that in that type of country, the minute they get 3 to 6 inches of snow or whatever, roughly something like that, they can't get into that. Now, if you go to certain places where maybe the deer are migrating not as much elevation grade, or for whatever reason they feed on different type of stuff in the in their summer range into early fall, and they're actually browsing the whole time, right? So if you have, I'm trying to think of a good example, but if you have deer that are moving from like the high desert country down to to the desert or lower desert country, a lot of times they're browsing on brush. Could be bitter brush, could be mountain mahogany, could be whatever in that area they're feeding on. They could be feeding on that in the summertime, right? And if that's the case, snow is not going to move them as quickly because they can get to that feed if there's snow, right? Like it's not covering up, it's not killing, the clovers and all of that and making it hard to get to. They can still get to a lot of that browse, so they may not, readily move as quickly as they will if they're really dependent on those little forbs, those little grasses or whatever. So long, detailed thing. But from what I saw, it didn't take much for them to move. And once they moved, they were they were down. Now, deer. The thing, like on that topic, mule deer. I saw this is if what I would say is they move. If they move because of snow, right? They're let's say they're moving between October 1st and October 20th, October 25th. If they're migrating hard during that period of time, it's usually because of this, right? It's feed related, and it's snow. So they're headed out of there. If that happens, they move in like a in a more concentrated way, right? You could really notice if you know the migration paths, you can really notice that deer are bombing out of the high country during that period of time. Now, if you don't get snow during that period of time, you're still going to get deer moving the 20th to 25th, of October. And this is specific to my area, but it depends on where you're at. It's going to vary a little bit. Obviously, if you're at a lower latitude like New Mexico or something like that, these dates are going to be a little bit different. But I've confirmed this talking to a bunch of biologists, including some of the best mule deer focused biologists on Earth, and they say that deer will move on photo period for sure. So unlike elk, they are going to move regardless of the snow conditions, regardless of the feed conditions, on a specific date in that region, in that area, if snow doesn't preemptively move them down. So what I would see in my areas in particular is I would see that if that happened, if the deer were moving off of just the photo period, the length of day, and not snow or lack of feed, it was more of a trickle, right? You'd see a slower, the deer were still moving, but you wouldn't see like just loads of them coming out of the high country. You just would see a slower trickle of them out of there. So yeah, that's my thoughts on snow cover. When I get to elk, you'll see that there's some pretty significant differences there. The next one's temperatures. So in my experience of all three of these species, really bears, elk, mule deer are the most sensitive to temperature in terms of their activity. And this was always the one that I would focus on if I got into late second rifle season, third season, fourth rifle season. So some of that overlaps with the rut, but outside of that, let's just assume that's not a variable. Um, those periods of time, I would if what I was looking for is if it got frigid cold and it got the type of cold that it was cold really cold at night. Say just to give you guys like specific numbers. So the Colorado high country, between 8,500 or 9,000 feet and 10,000 feet, right? Like you're hunting that type of country, you're getting frigid cold nights of like 0 degrees, -10 degrees, and then your daytime temperatures are only getting 5 degrees, 10 degrees, right? If you have, a night of that and a day of that will trigger it, but if you have like 2 days of those type of temperatures, you'll get a little lag, right? You'll get like, it could be just like a 5 hour lag, a 12-hour lag, whatever. But at some point after that really frigid chunk of time, deer will be everywhere, and it's just their metabolism going berserk. They have to get out and feed, and the nicest thing about it is that you can literally have a 2 day period like that that's crazy cold, right, in the Colorado mountains, and then it can flip, and you can have very warm temperatures, right? That's how Colorado is. It's how Montana is, and all these states are. Wyoming's the same way, right? You get 2 super cold days, and it's October 30th or November 1st, right? And then the next 2 days are super warm. But those next 2 days that are super warm, you can kill deer at 1 o'clock in the middle of the day. You can kill them at 11 o'clock in the bright burning sunshine because those 2 cold days threw them into a fight with their metabolism where they got to catch up and they've got to feed all day. And I love that if I hit it when I was guiding, because what it would give me is, say I'm guiding a guy for 5 days on a mule deer hunt, right? And I hit those type of conditions on 2 days. It basically just gave me like the equivalent of 5 more days of hunting time, because now I'm not just hunting those deer the first 2 hours of the day, the first 2 hours, or, the last 2 hours of the day, right? Now I'm hunting them all day long. Sometimes this would get so crazy because it would get so brutal third or fourth rifle season, going out and getting on a horse at 5 in the morning and riding in -10-degree temperatures. It's horrendous. You know what I mean? Nobody enjoys that, right? Well, if I knew that it had been cold, real cold for the last 24 hours, we wouldn't push it, man. We'd just get up at 7 o'clock and we'd hunt all day long because this deer would be out feeding, bucks would be out chasing does all day long. And that's the best deer hunting you can get if you get those big, get those frigid temperatures. And they don't necessarily have to stop, really. My example there kind of suggests that it stops. I'm just saying that you don't have to have it continuing. They still have to catch up because they burnt through so much during those frigid temperatures. If it stays cold, it's all good. They still got to be feeding and they'll be out during the day. So that is one of those things. I think I hit on it on a video recently. Somebody asked me some related question, and what was I? I'm trying to think when that was, but but that's like the best hunting is basically if that occurs, right? If I was looking for any sort of conditions on deer, that's the best. All right, so on elk, on elk, same deal. I covered it with rain, whiteout, snow, that sort of thing. They just hold up. Now, in terms of snow cover on elk, it takes triple the amount of snow or more, and it depends on it. A lot of times, it'll actually depend on the feed conditions that year. Elk will paw through snow, deep snow, to get to feed if they can tolerate it. Now, if it was a dry summer and there's not a lot of feed in the alpine, and down in the transition from the conifers to the aspen, there's not a lot of feed in there. They'll move quicker. They'll move out of the high country on, 12 and 12 inches of snow. They don't really give a shit about, but 18 inches of snow, 20 inches of snow. But if you got really good feed in the high country, I mean, I've seen bulls, hanging out in the high country in, basically like brisket deep snow, and they'll do that for a long period of time. And the other thing is that, unlike mule deer, in my experience, elk will bounce back up. So they will come out of the high country. If you get like a dump of snow, they'll pile out of the high country because they're looking for feed. And then if that snow comes off, melts off, just gets compressed, they'll start moving back up. And generally, what bulls will do, these post-rut bulls will do, is they know where the windswept slopes are, and so that, because they know that that's going to be the first area where they can get to feed up high, and they just know where the south facing exposure is, right? So generally, you're going to see them move back up to the high country after a snowstorm, and I do think that part of this is pressure based. Like, if they know they can get away from people by going back up, they'll do it, and they're going to go to the windswept stuff. They're going to go to the south facing slopes. Mountain goats do the same thing. It's more rugged country. But a lot of people don't know this, but mountain goats will actually, they'll actually winter really high. But they're highly dependent on one. They have a weird kind of like hibernation thing that's like, I could do a whole nother video on it because it's pretty cool. Hibernation is not the right kind of word, but they slow their metabolism around. But they winter in south facing stuff, steep enough stuff that doesn't keep snow, and where it gets windswept. So bull elk are generally, I say bulls because a lot of times the cows are less tolerant of it. They'll go down and they'll stay down there. They'll find an easy living spot. But bulls will try to stay up high elevation as much as they can, and they're going to go to that windswept stuff where they can find feed. Now,
Um, if you do get enough, and they'll do that to the bitter end. I used to live in an area where elk would winter, and then I could see way up above them. I could see from 8,200 feet. I could glass, and I could glass all the way up to damn near 12,000 feet. And in the middle of January, January, February, I would see bulls that were at my house at 8,000 feet, and then over a 5-day period, like a little warm snap, a bunch of wind blew off some slopes, they'd go up 2,000 feet of elevation. So they do it. They do it all year. You run into that when you're lion hunting too. You cannot believe where bull elk will go back up to. So that's one thing that for sure distinguishes them from mule deer. Now, oh yeah. So one thing for people to think about. Oh yeah, I I remember what I was thinking about on that deer but this just correlates to it. So the what somebody had asked me about was third rifle season, the longer season for hunting deer, right? Like the 9-day season, and then hunting the latter half of it, the last like 4 or 5 days of that season. And a lot of times what happens is you'll get a big cold snap like middle of their third season or first few days of third season, and it beats people up, so they leave, right? And then all of a sudden there's less hunters there, but you get those perfect deer conditions because you've got super cold weather that occurred, and now you got deer that are hungry and they're out all day, and they're easy to hunt. So the same dynamic happens with elk in terms of snow. Um, Before I hit on this, let me make sure everything. Have to do a little technology check mid go here. Yeah. So, anyways, uh, yeah, so on elk, you have the same dynamic. What'll happen during these seasons is it'll be a 7-day season, let's say, right? I don't know what it's going to end up because all the stuff's, particularly in Colorado, is up in the air. But different places are different, right? 5 days, any Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Colorado, rifle stuff, you're really talking about like 5 to 9 day seasons typically. So what'll happen sometimes is the first few days of the hunt or middle of the hunt dates, it gets crazy cold, and you get the dynamic I just mentioned, right? It just gets people, they're tired of freezing their asses off, so they leave. The other thing that happens is you get a massive snowstorm that happens during those type of dates in Colorado, and it'll put a bunch of snow on the ground, and a lot of people are tolerant of it because they think, oh, the hunting's going to get good. It just, like last night, it snowed 30 inches. It was crazy. We got the snow off the wall tent, but the elk hunting is going to get awesome. And then the elk hunting doesn't get awesome that day, right? And they don't see any new tracks. They don't see any new activity. And it frustrates them. And the other things they're thinking about is they're thinking, okay, I'm up here. Is this road back to the improved road? Can I get out of here now that there's 20, 30 inches on that? So that makes people nervous. They know it's going to be a pain in the ass. They're going to have to chain up. Maybe people are worried about them, whatever. Maybe even the highway to get, out of the mountains is going to be a big pain in their butt too. So all that starts adding up that day. Oh, the elk hunting didn't turn on, so they leave, right? So both of those conditions drive people out of the mountains, but both of those conditions make the hunting awesome, but sometimes with a lag, particularly this elk deal, right? You get a bunch of snow in the high country. Elk do not bomb out of the high country. They just hole up during the storm, and then a lot of times they won't be out of there for 24 hours, 30 hours. I mean, I cannot tell you. I mean, I know specific spots that elk migrate. I know some spots that when I was a little bitty boy, 5 or 6 years old, my dad used to drive up switchbacks, and we would look off the road, and we knew this is where elk would bomb out of the high country. And 5 hours after a big storm, nothing. 20 hours after a big storm, nothing. A day and a half, 30 hours after a big storm, 36 hours out of like a real big storm, and it would look like 10,000 elk came out of the high country. Just blew. It looked like a snowmobile had come down the hill, going 100 miles an hour and just plowing the crap out of the snow, right? Because so many elk bombed out of the high country. But there's usually a lag. And I personally think what it is total speculation. I have no idea if this is the case, but I think what it is, it takes them that amount of time to realize, like, oh shit, like it's pretty tough for us to find feed here. Like we got to roll. But when they roll, they're going somewhere. And it could be that, in that interim, the interim stuff, they're getting hunted hard and they know that. Who knows? But a lot of times they just bypass a lot of country and they're going somewhere. So there'll be that lag and then they're bombed out of there. So that's again just correlates back to, you know, try if you can make it through and hunt the latter part of the season where people are leaving. Sometimes these things will benefit you. And on that subject, on elk in the snow, people ask me a lot about tracking bull elk in the snow, and usually it's pretty. Once you've seen like a bull elk track in the snow, you'll know it's a bull, not a cow or a calf or whatever. And my answer to it is, I think surprises people, and that's that I used to track bulls like that all the time. I used to do it on horses, even. So, one strategy to do is after a good snow, it doesn't have to be like this elk moving snow, but that helps. Is same deal. A lot of times, like the first day, won't be a lot of movement, maybe a little bit, but eventually you're gonna find tracks. And we used to call it just like bulldogging tracks. I don't know. That might be like a term that I made up, but you just get on tracks with horses and just start riding the track out. Now, the thing about horses, and you can do it with vehicles too in an area that's got a lot of roads, and you're like glassing tracks, and you should glass tracks. Just, I mean, I think sometimes people they they discount that. Like if you get a good fresh snow in the high country, just glass for tracks. It's pretty easy to identify elk tracks once you know what they look like from a distance. They're broader than deer. They're bigger. You can figure that out. But a lot of times you can glass the track out to the bull, or like they went into that timber. So go in there and figure out the little pocket where that single bull or bachelor group of post-rut bulls has gone. It's a very good tactic. Now, if you're just trailing them, like you get in a track and given the topography or whatever, you just gotta trail them, with a horse, or maybe you're driving down the road. There's elk tracks on the road. That it's weird, but particularly on horses, elk will tolerate you pretty well. So what I would do is I would get in a track. There's usually like pretty deep snow, and I would just like follow the track and be scanning way ahead of me, and hopefully I would see elk. And then if I would get to a situation where I saw spots where I could glass, I'd stop, tie my horses up, glass, and keep glassing the track ahead and see if I could find where the bull went in. Because you don't want to bump them, but you really don't know the speed they're going, right? So you also have to cover ground. Now, one problem is if you're walking in their track, they're super sensitive to that. And I don't know why, but hunters on foot walking in a track, you got to be really careful about bumping elk, because they're gonna wind you, see you 1,000 yards away, 700 yards away, 800 yards away, where a lot of times on a horse you can ride right by them a lot of times. And it's actually the same, more so with a vehicle in a lot of areas too, right? Like that you saw some elk tracks going down the road, you're following them slowly, you see they go down into this canyon. Now you're watching them on the other side, you're just driving along. A lot of times you'll look over, and sure enough, like in the tracks are elk, and they're just staring at you through the timber watching that vehicle. Now the minute you stop, they may haul ass, but if you just keep driving, they'll sit there and look at you. Same deal dynamic with horses. But on foot, no way. Generally, elk will not tolerate that. So what I'm getting at here is if you're tracking elk in the snow on foot, which is, a lot of us have to be in that situation, you have to J-hook a lot. Like, J-hook up to spots where you can glass ahead. Keep doing that. Keep doing that. It can be super annoying, but because it takes time and you just have no idea where that bull is. But you have to do it because they're really intolerant of hunters on foot. And you can figure that out tracking. Like you can see if a bull is just roaming. Usually, if a bull is just got a slow paced track, like your standard track, and the way to, if you guys don't know this, if you see a track in the snow, a bull that's hauling ass, they're so heavy, they when they hit their toes kind of spread out a little bit, But the other thing is even in deep snow, they typically are going to throw up some dirt because they're going to hit the mud, unless it's frozen solid or something like that. But even if it's frozen solid, brutal cold, you can look down in there and they're going to pound through that snow every time. Now, if they're just walking at a normal pace, they're usually just setting their foot down and they'll just compact the snow. You're not going to see like the angular, like wham, like hit into the snow like you will with a bull that's running in the fling of the snow, stuff like that. The other thing, if it is brutal cold, a lot of times you'll see where elk are slowly moving around and you'll see blood in their tracks. It's something for people to know because I think some people always associate that with a wounded bull. And a lot of times when you get the ice crust in the colder temperatures, those bulls, I think they walk around fairly slow in those conditions because it hurts them. But you'll see where there'll be a little blood on the top of the track there where they're hitting there. Every time they pick their foot up, they keep hitting it. I think they get beat up that way. So you'll see that sometimes. But anyways, it's good to know if bulls are running off of pressure or something if you get in this situation versus just living somewhere. Because post-rut bulls, I've covered this a ton, but a lot of times they're not going very far. So if you got a slow track that's meandering, a lot of times like track, you'll be following them. It doesn't even seem like they're going anywhere. There's like roaming around kind of in circles in like an area. That's a bull that's not startled. He's not going anywhere. And you got to be really careful because he's probably right there, right? So really try to make sure he doesn't bust your wind or whatever before you see him. But bulls that are scared and you have pressure on them, they generally beeline in a straight line it fast and as far as they can go. And if you're tracking tracks like that, I mean, you, it wouldn't be my first option. Like if I had better options, I would do that before I track a bull like that because you could be in for a haul. Like they'll go a long ways if that's what you're tracking. So, all right, guys. So I hope that covered kind of my thoughts on the different environmental conditions across the species. I didn't talk a lot about archery season on any of these species. So I guess we're really specifically deer and elk, like September archery season in temperatures. So the only one that probably applies is that the hotter it is, the drier it is, the more elk will move their rutting activity nocturnal. That's for sure the case. And then in general, deer and elk, the most hunters have run into this regardless of the species. The hotter it is in that period of time, the shorter period of time you have to hunt them effectively. They feed for shorter periods of time in the morning and at night, and they're more nocturnal in their feeding patterns. So that's primarily, how that plays in. There's a lot of people that I think, I don't want to say like, they might just, they overthink the idea that it really affects the rut. I mean, look, elk calves are basically born the same week in all these areas year after year. There's a little bit of variation to that, but very little, way less than people think there is. So that means that the elk are bred basically the same time every year. So when you hear a lot of people say, "Oh, the rut's late because of temperatures," or "the rut's early because of temperatures," it doesn't. There's no empirical. There's not. There. I've never seen good empirical evidence of that. Period. Because they're being born basically at the same time. I know guys that raise elk for a living, commercially, like in more of like controlled settings, and they say for sure it doesn't matter. It's all from their perspective. It's photo period, and then some other in conditions of the cows and stuff like that. Much more so than environmental conditions. So that's my take on it. Until better evidence comes out there, I suppose. Okay, so I can't believe that took me 48 minutes, guys. I apologize for. Hopefully, some of that detail is helpful to you guys. I apologize for being so long-winded on that. So let's talk about must-have gear.